If there was a God who created the universe, had decisions about what kind of universe he wanted to make, and created this one specifically, then didn't God specifically choose the universe in which I would lose my faith and become an atheist? Didn't God choose the universe in which we don't have access to confirm rationally, reasonably, the supernatural? Didn't God pick the universe where the single most important facet of his message is not clearly evidenced? I don't know. Historians want the best sources. There's a number of problems we could address as to whether or not, do we have any eyewitness accounts? Not really, but eyewitness accounts aren't particularly reliable anyway. And I can take you and introduce you to people who claim that they've been abducted by aliens, and they will tell similar stories. You see them all over the History Channel, which is poorly named, by the way. They will tell you their stories, and they are all convinced of this. I don't believe them. I believe that they've had some experience or trying to convey experience. I don't believe their explanation for that experience. Does their story become more believable 2,000 years later with no further updates and when we're farther removed from our ability to investigate their claims? Do all those Elvis sightings turn into a religion at some point? I'm not arguing that, it's all a hoax or an invented fiction. I'm simply saying this is important, and it doesn't seem to be safeguarded. It doesn't seem to be reasonable. I have no good foundation upon which to conclude that the supernatural exists. So when somebody says, did Jesus rise from the dead? My answer is, I don't know. I do not believe that that happened because there's insufficient evidence to support that particular conclusion. I'm happy to be convinced, but I'm not going to be convinced by fallacies. I'm not going to be convinced by appeals to the Bible until you demonstrate the reliability of it. I'm not going to be convinced by appeals to the supernatural until you demonstrate that the supernatural is there. I'm not sitting here saying, no, I won't believe in God. I'm an atheist because I took that passage from 1 Peter 3:15 seriously. And I wanted to be able to give a reason for my faith, and I can't. So I gave it up. Thanks.
At this time, Dr. Lacono will have 12 minutes for rebuttal.
Well, thank you, Matt. In my opening statement, you recall that I made two major contentions. Number one, empirical data strongly suggest that reality has a supernatural dimension. And number two, historical data strongly suggest that Jesus rose from the dead. I'd like now to review those two major contentions in light of what Matt just argued. Let's begin with my first major contention, that empirical data strongly suggest that reality has a supernatural dimension. And here I provided 4 lines of evidence in support of that contention. I argued for paranormal phenomena, well-evidenced near-death experiences, veridical apparitions, and extreme answered prayer. What Matt argued is he came back and he said, well, you can't test those. They got to be scientifically there for test. Well, the science disciplines have different methods. There is no single scientific method. A geologist has a different kind of method than, say, a chemist or an astronomer. And there are certain, not all science has a scientific method where you can test something or you can repeat this in a lab. For example, geology, evolutionary biology, paleontology, archaeology, all of these sciences, you can't test these things. You can't do controlled and repeatable experiments in these. So it's like Matt wants a kind of gadget with a battery in it where if it's a miracle, you point it at it and push a button and a green light flashes. That's the wrong kind of test that you're looking for. It's like taking your laptop and put it in an MRI hoping that it will diagnose why it's running slowly. It doesn't work. Second, I did provide these 4 evidences, and Matt just really didn't address these. They virtually went dropped. He just said, well, you can't verify. Well, some of them you can verify. Like I mentioned with the approximately 300 well-evidenced near-death experiences, 200 alone are in that book, where in order to be included in that book by these scientists, it had to have at least one external source who could corroborate the occurrence of the event. Not that this person thought they experienced it, but that when this person said, hey, I met so-and-so and they told me this, they could, boy, I wish I could give the example. There's so many examples, I just don't have the time. Well, I'll give one real quick if I can. There's this one example where this mother was dying. She was in the hospital, ready to die, and she wanted to see, or actually she didn't want to see her son. She was estranged from him. He had caused him great financial trouble. He wanted to see her. She refused. The daughter was with her mom in the hospital. The son was in a bar across from the hospital crying at the bar when all of a sudden his mom came walking in. She was dressed. She came in the bar. She saw him. She started walking toward him. He stood up. He said, Mom, what are you doing here? He starts walking, and some people got in the way, and she was gone. Well, a few moments later, her mom in the hospital woke up, and she told her daughter, I just had a weird dream. I dreamt that I was in a bar, and I saw my son crying at the bar, and he started walking to me, and then I woke up. And the doctors, a doctor who was there who had been tending was able to verify this with the son, that that's what he saw independently, and then verify it with the daughter, and then mom died that night. So you see these kinds of things. That's the kind of stories that we find, 200 to 300 of these, so they are verified. Second, Matt goes by methodological naturalism to say that science, we are bound, or barred, I should say, from investigating the supernatural. That's bunk. We are not barred. Now, a lot of scientists tie their hands behind their back. That's called methodological naturalism, where they're not allowed to consider the supernatural. But let me tell you, methodological naturalism, simply stated, is a safe space for skeptical scholars and scientists where they can hide from serious consideration from solutions that involve supernatural or God. You know, those trigger words for them because it makes them uncomfortable. That's what methodological naturalism is. And it fails, and here's why. Let's suppose that astronomers have been watching a comet for years, and all of a sudden they do some calculations. They say, this comet is going to slam into the moon's surface tomorrow. And so the next day, you have the Hubble Space Telescope and all these planetariums that are zoomed in on the lunar surface, and they watch, boom, as the impact happens. And as the lunar dust settles, there's a message embedded on the lunar surface that says God exists, and it's in Greek and Hebrew. Well, according to methodological naturalism, a scientist couldn't even affirm that the event had occurred. It would certainly be a supernatural event, and because of that, they couldn't even affirm that the event had occurred. Well, of course you could affirm the event occurred. Maybe you can't confirm as a scientist that God is the one behind it, but you could say this miraculous event occurred and leave the cause undetermined. That's why methodological naturalism fails. It actually, in the end, it could actually serve to be a science stopper. He said, you can't test whether you saw your dead grandmother. Well, I gave an example of that near-death experience where, in some cases, you actually can. He says, Ehrman comes up with the definition of miracle as the least probable explanation. Ehrman is just simply wrong here. Listen, in my doctoral research, I found 23 definitions for miracle. In fact, 2 of them are Ehrman's. Different ones that he gives. If miracles are the least probable explanation, really? Well, so what if I were beheaded here on stage by some terrorists and they fled, leaving my headless corpse here on the stage? And then you all leave the auditorium, an hour later you're outside of the auditorium and you're talking to the police and media, and I come walking out of the auditorium, head attached, smiling, scars on my neck. I said, I've been to heaven. And God brought me back in order to verify the truth of Jesus' gospel message. And by the way, Matt, while I was up there, I talked to this relative of yours that died 10 years ago, and they shared with me a private conversation that only you and that relative had. I could not have possibly known. So is a miracle the least probable explanation? And since historians must choose the most probable, we'd have to say anything, even group hallucination, is more probable? No, that's methodological naturalism. That's the safe space for skeptics. Okay, so then he talks about, he says, look, if someone said that they saw a spaceship, would we believe them? Should we believe them? Well, we could say, yes, he says, that they had the experience, but we couldn't confirm their interpretation. Well, I agree with that. I agree with that entirely. But then what we would look at, we'd say, well, were there group appearances? That they all saw this spaceship? Were there descriptions? Did they think they were seeing the same thing? Are there things like that there's no possible way, given our technology, that anything on Earth could have produced this? We got to look at we put everything together and we consider the plausibility and all this kind of stuff, and you compare hypotheses. That's what you got to do, and you do it on a case-by-case basis. He said, what about Elvis sightings? Well, you can come up with numerous naturalistic explanations for that. Check out his grave, you know. You could verify whether he's alive that way. There's certainly Elvis impersonators. There are people who look like Elvis. There are people who lie about these things. Any of these would seem to be more probable explanations when you compare hypotheses using these 4 criteria that I mentioned. So you just subjected the various hypotheses to strictly controlled historical method. There are ways of determining these things. He says, Paul, the disciples convinced doesn't mean that we should be convinced. I agree. That's why we use strictly controlled historical method. You formulate hypotheses based on the known data, and you weigh those hypotheses to see which one is the most probable. And when you do that, I only did it with hallucination, but when you do it with all the other naturalistic hypotheses, you find out resurrection comes out on top every time. He says the supernatural has no explanatory power. I'm not sure what he meant by that, but he says then he goes on to explain, he says, well, look, you can't just say that because you can't come up with another explanation that means you should go with God. In other words, a God of the gaps explanation. Hey, I agree with that entirely. But when you look at the evidence, you pull the historical bedrock together, you formulate your hypotheses, you subject them to strictly controlled historical method, you weigh those, and if the event comes out and the method points to the event actually occurring, then you try to investigate the cause. Now, if we look at something like the resurrection, we say, there's just no possible way. Given our current understanding of science and the laws of nature, we know that could not happen by natural causes. At that point, based on our understanding of natural law, we are right to infer a supernatural cause, especially when you have Jesus claiming that he's God's uniquely divine Son and predicts his resurrection from the dead. We are well within our epistemic rights to say this is probably what happened, that Jesus rose and it was because God raised him from the dead. I can't as a historian verify that it was God, but I certainly could say as a historian, it appears that God was probably the best candidate for the event. He says that I would have to assume that God exists and wanted to raise Jesus. No, I wouldn't. Nowhere in my argument did I assume that God existed or wanted to raise Jesus. Like I said, you look at the data, you let the data speak for themselves apart from presuppositions. I mean, that's what a good historian is going to do. It's going to allow the data to challenge our presuppositions, to challenge our current worldview. The danger in not doing that is very clear. Bad philosophy corrupts good history. And so we have to allow the data to challenge our presuppositions. He says, well, people don't think God exists, will reject this. Well, I understand that. But again, you've got to allow the data to challenge our presuppositions. He says, well, why is this not the most the clear fact? Why isn't this the most clear thing, the resurrection of Jesus? Why is there confusion in the Bible? This is God's responsibility, one could say. Well, I guess you could say that. Or you could say, as he suggested, we are human, we are flawed, we are fallible, and of course we're going to interpret things differently, even within theological things. God even allowed Paul and James to disagree on certain things, as we find in the New Testament. So, I can look and say, well, we're flawed human beings, and apparently God is okay with us having free wills and disagreeing with one another at times. But these all agreed on the essentials of the faith, and I think that is what's important. And in Acts 17:27, it says God wants us to grope for him like a blind person looking for someone to anchor to. He wants us to seek after him. And so our questions, these disputes that come up, cause us to dig deeply, those of us who are interested in knowing the truth. So again, my 2 major contentions that I give, they still stand. Empirical data strongly suggest that reality includes a supernatural dimension, and the historical data strongly suggest that Jesus rose from the dead. Thank you.
Matt Dillahunty would now give his 12-minute rebuttal.
So there's something in debates that I wish would stop happening. And I'm not picking on you, but you did it and somebody else does it. Person one talks, then person two talks, then person one gets back up and says, Matt didn't address what I said. Well, that's what I'm doing now. This is the rebuttal period. So you can't criticize somebody's opening remarks for not addressing everything that was in your opening. So we have the stories about near-death experiences. The emphasis, of course, being on near-death and not death experiences. We also have accounts of people who've gone on to an afterlife and come back with stories that we've later found are fraudulent. They've acknowledged that they're fraudulent. So in a world where two people can both say, I've had an experience where I've died and gone to the other side and spoke, how do you tell which one's correct? How do you tell if either of them are correct? Methodological naturalism is the foundation of science. It's not a safe space for skeptics. It is a recognition from philosophy of science that until we actually have the ability to investigate and confirm that the supernatural exists, we don't get to appeal to it. It doesn't bar us from testing claims that are attributed to the supernatural. No scientist, if that comet hit and spelled out something, no scientist on the grounds of methodological naturalism or any other scientific model would be prohibited from attesting that the event occurred. They would just be in a position of, we don't know how or why this occurred because we don't have a model that we can use to apply to this. We have no explanation. And the idea that as you heard him say a minute ago, based on our current understanding, we could be justified in appealing to the supernatural. Well, that's the problem. We think we have an amazingly good understanding and that we are the smartest and wisest that have ever lived on this planet. We're doing good. We've got incredible technology. And this poisons our mind to think that I have enough information that I can exclude natural explanations and just go charging towards the supernatural, even though I can't actually demonstrate the supernatural. That is what science is trying to prevent. Spectral evidence. I'm not looking for a dial or a meter. I'm not talking about being able to put the supernatural in a beaker. And I think geologists and others would be shocked to learn that they don't have testable disciplines, when in fact that's what they do. As in biology, you can make predictions about what you will discover from the past in the rock. And those predictive models are what allow us to do things. Science, while maybe I am arguing for scientism, some people would actually say that. I'm not claiming that it is the only path. Just that science is the most consistently reliable pathway that has demonstrated its efficacy for an accurate understanding of the world. If there are 10 people who come up and tell you, I've had a supernatural experience, exactly what test would you propose? Don't have to be in a beaker. What investigation techniques would you use to figure out which, if any, of them were correct? This is the reason that there are so many different denominations. This is the reason why there are so many different religions, because we are all incredibly sure that the conclusion we've reached is right. I'm so smart, I couldn't be fooled. This is what magicians and con artists exploit on a regular basis. Near-death experiences have been tested. There's a number of different ways that you can try to confirm that somebody is actually like floating out of their body. They've put, in the operating rooms, they'll put messages up there to see if anybody can actually see and report. Nobody's ever been able to actually accurately report this. There are a bunch of certainly weird stories, but nobody's essentially passed the preliminary type of test that I talked about before. Apparitions and ghosts. How do you tell which of those are real? Certainly some of them aren't real. Certainly some people are mistaken or hallucinating or lying. How did you rule out all of these naturalist explanations? Oh, it's just really improbable that there would be a group hallucination. Well, there are plenty of people who sit outside of Area 51 who seem to be sharing a group hallucination about an alien abduction or alien spacecrafts. It's rare, I agree. It is bizarre and almost unimaginable, but that doesn't make it impossible. That makes it highly improbable. How probable is the supernatural, and how did you come to that conclusion? In the cases of extreme answered prayer, if he had his head chopped off and came back out to talk to me later, that'd be pretty compelling. That would lead me towards those possibilities, only in the sense that, you know what? I don't have an explanation for how that happened, I'd love to find out. We don't have examples like that. Extreme answered prayer. Somebody got some funds. Well, I invite you to go to whydoesn't-God-heal-amputees.com. We have con artists trying to demonstrate that, I can grow your leg longer and all this other stuff. The same sorts, these are evangelists, by the way, and I doubt that you would actually be supportive of faith healers who are using simple con tricks, of leg lengthening to convince people. Now they're atrocious. They're getting them to throw away your medications. Jesus will heal you. They're killing people. There are people really dying. Irrespective of whether there's a God, irrespective of whether or not God can heal, suggesting that people should throw out their meds and just let Jesus heal it should be criminal. But granted, they're free to do that. Empirical data strongly suggests that reality has a supernatural component to it. Well, I would say that what empirical data strongly suggests is that people attribute things to the supernatural when they can't come up with an explanation for it, and that's fallacious. How do you come up with empirical data for the supernatural? This is the bait and switch that we're seeing with the argument from the supernatural here. All he's really said is, hey, there's a whole bunch of these experiences, and because we can't think of a better explanation, given our current understanding, we are justified in accepting a supernatural one. I do not and cannot accept that because it is obviously fallacious, and it leads to you believing things that are not true. Now, you can't put God in a beaker, you can't put God in a test tube, you can't put the supernatural there. So your science just isn't sufficient to investigate. I agree, it's not. So how do we investigate it? What methodology do we use to determine that this is true? Is it our fault? Is it the fault of science that it can't confirm this? That's like saying that, your daughter can't lift the 300 pounds. That's not her fault. Science is trying to find the best explanation and acknowledging when the answer is we don't know or we don't know yet. And it realizes that, imagine we had spent our entire lives in this particular room, which some of you probably feel like right now, but there are no windows, you're blocked in, you have no access to anything out. How do you know whether that wall just keeps going forever or if there's something on the other side of it? How do you go about testing that? I had a conversation about the supernatural with my friend and apologist, Blake Junta, and I was asking him, how do you demonstrate, let's imagine there's somebody outside this room who can communicate telepathically and telekinetically. What would you do to go through to find out if that's happening? And he gave all kinds of great examples. There would be things moving around the room, and he would be communicating to me what he's going to move around the room, this sort of thing. Okay? How do you demonstrate that there's a God? All of a sudden, you get wildly different examples. Why wouldn't it be the same? There's answered prayer. Well, prayer has been tested. Intercessory prayer has been tested by the Templeton Foundation, which has some motivation for it to come out in favor of prayer. And what do they find? Prayer works at the rate of chance, unless you actually know you're being prayed for, and then it works less. And they have hypothesized that there was some kind of performance anxiety of knowing that people were praying for you, and this gave you anxiety because you felt compelled to get better so that the test results would go. When it comes to the minimal facts approach, I find it strange to say that Paul is the best source. I understand, I agree that scholars hold this position, and it may in fact be the case that Paul is the best source. But what do we know about that best source? Well, never met Jesus while he was alive, claims he did later, after he was re-alive. Wasn't around for any of Jesus' events, wasn't around for the death, wasn't around for the crucifixion, the burial, wasn't there to see the empty tomb. Right? There were people who were supposedly far closer in time to these events than Paul was, who's writing decades afterwards. He's the best. There's a reason why when somebody comes up to you and tells you a story that they heard, you're a little dubious. And in Paul's case, we have, I got it directly from Jesus after he was dead. I'm not saying that didn't happen. I'm saying, how do you confirm that this is what happened? The consistency of gospel messages among a bunch of people viewed from thousands of years in the future. This is something that needs better evidential support. And this is why we end up arguing about it over and over again. Now, I'm not closed off. I didn't get mad at God. Nothing bad happened to me. I just wanted to have the best model of the world in my head. And as unfortunate as it may be for proponents of the supernatural, methodological naturalism, and I don't know why we went to safe spaces and triggering in our demolishment of the single most reliable path to an accurate understanding of reality that the world has ever known, isn't barred from investigating reality. And if your God manifests and is detectable in reality, then it should be confirmable. And by the way, if there is a God, God should easily be able to provide convincing evidence to everybody. And you say, oh, well, he has, and you just won't accept it. Then he hasn't. Because God should be able to convince me, God should be able to convince skeptics, God should be able to convince Muslims and Hindus, and that hasn't happened. Oh, it's just all of these ad hoc explanations, which I agree we should avoid, of, well, it's our fallen nature. Well, it's free will. Okay. I understand what you're saying. But that doesn't change the facts. Even if you're right, barring an acceptance that it's possible to raise someone from the dead, or that it's possible that there's a being who can raise someone from the dead, you don't have a justification. What you have is, here's an empty tomb, we don't have a natural explanation, so we're just going to say that because we know so much, the most reasonable explanation for these copies of translations of facts is that Jesus rose from the dead. How do you demonstrate that? I can't. I haven't heard any attempt to do so. And so I'm stuck.